Welcome to the GreenPilled.network podcast. If you're just joining us, we are building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers using crypto to bring positive-sum digital systems to the world. This podcast features the people who are doing it and is published every Tuesday and Thursday. If you want to learn more, visit our website at GreenPilled.network, where you can download the GreenPilled book for free, join the Discord, and become a member of your local GreenPilled.network chapter. My guest today is Nadia Asparouhova. Nadia is back on the podcast today. We did an episode with her a few months ago. She's a writer and thought leader in the space and has been building in public for the better part of a decade in Web2 and is now participating in the Summer of Protocols research program, which was an 18-week program funded by the Ethereum Foundation. As part of her participation in the Summer of Protocols, she wrote a paper entitled Dangerous Protocols that will be released in the not too distant future. I'm excited to have her back on the show to talk about her research and her upcoming essay on dangerous protocols. We are doing a series of episodes on Summer of Protocols, which has been spearheaded by Venkatesh Rao and Tim Baiko of the Ethereum Foundation. It's all about studying the field of protocol research. What if instead of taking an agent or institution-centric view on history, on human coordination, we were to look at protocols and how they affect human coordination. And so I've got a slew of guests that have gone through the Summer of Protocol research program in 2023, which we think could be a foundational part of the establishment of protocol research as a field in the future. And Nadia was a participant. In this episode, we talk about dangerous protocols. So basically, the idea of protocols can be bad or dangerous, not just utopian or not just used for human coordination. And I think that Nadia, I just really appreciate the way that she thinks. I've been following Nadia ever since she wrote a seminal report on open source sustainability back in the 2010s. And for those of you who've been following my career for since the start of Gitcoin, you know that Gitcoin's original mission was to grow and sustain open source software. So Nadia has been an influential person for me getting into open source sustainability. And as she's gotten more interested in protocols and the Ethereum space, I've been following her work, and it's just really such a pleasure to have her on the podcast. It's not an understatement to say that she's a hero to me and to many in the open source sustainability space. So this episode with Nadia Asparouhova talks about dangerous protocols, and we are continuing our series on the Summer of Protocols. So coordination, I hope you enjoy this episode with Nadia.
ValleyDAO is an open global collective working to finance and democratize the governance of synthetic biology technologies to protect the future of our planet. Research and progress into synthetic biology is critically constrained by the world of nation-state regulations and bureaucracy from middlemen. But the potential that synthetic biology has for the world is massive. It can produce a world in total harmony with nature. We can grow stuff using cells like software. It's awesome. And the best part is we no longer have to pull carbon out of the ground to grow and maintain civilization. Don't you think we should be funding this? ValleyDAO does, and that's what they're here to do, to try and make the SolarPunk world of tomorrow a reality today. So join ValleyDAO right now and save the planet at valleydao.bio.
Hey Nadia, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Pretty good. Really excited to enter the headspace of Summer of Protocols. So tell me about your experience with Summer of Protocols and what y'all were trying to do and how you think about the world within the Summer of Protocols.
When I first heard about it from, I think, Tim Baiko, I thought it was just a really cool, rare opportunity kind of on this like meta level to have like a bunch of different independent researchers who've typically worked on the internet to come together and think about a shared theme. So just the structure of the program was pretty interesting to, I think, for a lot of people, myself included, not just sort of working alone on a new topic this time, but actually like collaborating and talking to people in the way that you might have at like, you know, an academic campus or something like that. So yeah, I think everyone was touching on this topic of what are protocols, what do they mean in the world today, why are they significant, where are they going? But everyone kind of took a very different tack and approach. And I think talking through our different approaches and interests was actually, for someone like me who usually works alone all the time, it was actually enormously beneficial to get lots of different perspectives on the same topic, and I think made everyone's work better.
So as far as I understand it, the headspace was, instead of taking an agent-centric or institution-centric view of history, what if we looked at history as through the lens of protocols, protocol-centric history all the way from handshakes to democracy to TCP/IP, Is that too reductionist, or is that how would you encapsulate the headspace of summer protocols? Are we taking a protocol centric view of history and human coordination?
I think some people took a historical view. I definitely do a lot of like historical background research for my piece. I think like the way I sort of broadly described it was that I think in tech in particular, tech, crypto, wherever, when we talk about protocols, people have a pretty like technical association with what protocols are. And so they think about like blockchains, or they think about TCP/IP or whatever. There's a sort of like shared sense or desire from the researchers in the program that, you know, there's like, what are protocols really in terms of beyond just being lines of code, or there's some under discussed aspect of like how protocols actually affect society that there is no real body of research on that. If you try to read about protocols, most of it is just like, you know, technical implementation specs, things like that. So wanting to create a body of research that is more about the social implications of like what these things really mean in our lives. I think there's, particular to sort of my project that summer, I think there's just like a lot of rhetoric that flies around about like the benefits of protocols or the harms of protocols, and like, is that even really consistent? Like, I don't think that conversation is very consistent, and there isn't really a shared understanding of what protocols really are, especially in connection to how they've historically been used and applied. So yeah, I think the mandate was very broad in that way. And again, people just took like very different angles on it, but that was my interest in it. And I think that was part of the goal of the program.
I wonder if you could maybe ground the audience's experience in talking about protocols with a tangible example of a protocol. Maybe one way to ask this is, what's your favorite protocol, or what's an example of a protocol that you would love to bring up?
Oh man. Gosh, I don't know if I have a favorite protocol, but I think like maybe some of like the disconnect that I felt that led me to my particular project was seeing how people talk about protocols in crypto governance was something that's kind of like stuck in my mind for the last few years. I used to spend a little bit more time digging around that space, and maybe less so now, but just hearing a lot of this conversation around like how protocols can help govern us in this more, I guess, like prescriptive way that to me felt, or often feels just sort of like disconnected from how I think about sort of human social governance. And, but there are historical examples of protocols and how they're used in governance. Diplomatic protocols, I think, are a good example of this. So in international diplomacy, you have, you know, a set of customs, and you have like literally like chief protocol officers that are like governing how heads of state will like interact with each other and what their customs are. You have protocols for international diplomacy, and they are called protocols, but they're a very different type of protocol from, say, having sort of like these prescriptive ways of like enforcing governance between people that are, maybe just more like grounded in like technology versus like social norms. And so examining maybe like some of that disparity was interesting to me.
This is calling to mind for me. I think that there was a 2x2 matrix that was somewhere in the Summer of Protocols website at summerofprotocols.com. And there was a spectrum between, I think it was small protocols, so something like handshakes, to larger protocols that are something like international diplomacy, which are, you know, like a suite of different combined protocols. And then another axis in the 2x2 matrix was soft protocols, things that are kind of squishy, and then protocols that are immutable. And so, you know, in this matrix, I'm kind of thinking about crypto protocols as being like hard and contained by immutable blockchain-based protocols. They make the human form around the computer, whereas it feels like traditional international protocols might be a little bit more soft and malleable. Is that a fair way of categorizing it?
I ended up landing on the assertion that I think like protocols are fundamentally social in nature. So maybe all true protocols, quote unquote, at least the way I define them. And by the way, I think like one of the things that really came out of this summer was that we could not come up with a single definition of protocols. Like it is a very fuzzy concept. It sounds like a failure, but I actually think it's really a success. But anyway, in the way that like I have sort of thought about protocols, I think of them as being primarily social in nature. And so technology is maybe what like codifies a protocol or makes a protocol more explicit or visible. But in the end, it's, you know, what is actually like driving the behavior and the participation in a protocol is something else entirely. I think we especially see this with this tension between social media platforms and protocols right now. And people sort of attempting to constantly reinvent new social platforms, but in the end falling into like the same pitfalls every time, is because there's like these underlying social protocols that are not really tied to the technology, not really tied to any specific platform or instantiation of it, that we just keep repeating over and over again if we don't change something.
Well, I'm wondering if you could talk, I want to ask about your paper that you wrote about dangerous protocols. But first, before we get into that, I have one more question about the Summer of Protocols program itself, which is, what do you think the meta of the research program is? What effect do you want to have on the world, and what were you all trying to do by being there together?
Yeah, I think I'm leaving that more to sort of like the vision of the folks that are running the program. But my hope for it coming into it was that we can do like a little bit of field building, I guess. And so for other people that had these questions around, hey, there seems to be a lacking dialogue around how protocols actually influence society, or I'm noticing these sort of inconsistencies in how people talk about protocols, or just like looking for that kind of language. I think for everyone that did participate in it, it felt like there was just very little out there. And now hopefully for future people, they can kind of say, oh, here's a body of research that, actually tackled this topic. And hopefully just create more conversation around that.
If we were looking back at this from 2030, 2023 Summer of Protocols could be the point in time in which the protocol research field, the study of protocols, was actually established. Like, this could be a new field that's studied from an academic perspective and increases the body of human knowledge about protocols and the way they help humans coordinate, interact, process things.
Yeah, we actually had a lot of really healthy debates about, should protocol studies or something like that be a field? Should this be something that is disseminated or more like rooted in academia, or should it live in the land of independent research or whatever? But I think like wherever that goes, my personal view is there absolutely could be an entire field around it that doesn't exist today.
Okay, so let's dive deep on dangerous protocols. So why did you choose this research topic? And if you could give us a broad strokes overview of the paper on dangerous protocols that you wrote, that'd be great.
I started out with a different topic when I first joined, and then just ended up sort of converging on these questions around how noticing this tension in the conversation about protocols, especially I think in the realm of, both crypto and maybe like tech more broadly. People are always talking about protocols as this like tool for liberation and how it's going to free us from platforms, it's going to free us from control. And then trying to reconcile that with my sort of like longer historical view and understanding of protocols as a way of simplifying decision-making and simplifying, the amount of individual control that anyone can actually exert. And so, I had this question in my mind of like, are protocols actually meant to be tools for liberation, or are they tools for control? And what would we sort of like do with that information? So I ended up kind of trying to put some more structure around what that really means, and talking about how protocols are this sort of fundamentally social concept rather than a technical concept, and how they might initially be created by a specific entity, or they might initially be specified by these like hard technical constraints like code, or even like your physical built environment. But then like in the end, they become really, they kind of escape these hard constraints and become internalized into our own identities. And so we become our own enforcers of protocols, where we feel that like complying with a protocol or a social protocol is just like sort of like part of who we are. And then kind of taking that and applying that to, in particular, I think just sort of like how like online discourse has evolved in recent years, and how we've sort of all become victims of this like protocolized type thinking, where we're kind of spitting out these views and opinions that we think are our own, like we truly believe are our own individual forms of self-expression, but are actually reflecting this like protocolized mindset, protocolization of ideas. And so I talk initially about how, we think about this early industrialized age of protocolized thinking that was much more closely associated with like a bureaucratic mindset. And now today, the modern version of the bureaucratic mindset is the crisis mindset, where we're all being governed by these like crises that are, protocolized versions of ideas.
Well, maybe let's step through some of these ideas one by one. I'm interested in this dual nature of protocols, specifically simplifying complexity versus exerting control. And I'm wondering if you have an example of something in each of those categories, a protocol for simplifying complexity and also a protocol for exerting control.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, like one of the examples I used about simplifying, I think like really like any one protocol can kind of be used in both directions in a good or a bad way. So one example that I used was standardized testing or like aptitude testing for getting into school or getting into applying for a job. And in the one sense, it is a useful, like the practice of using aptitude testing is a useful protocol because it does simplify complexity around trying to evaluate every candidate on their own terms would just be a lot of paperwork and a lot of context, especially if you're talking about, like school admissions and you have tons of candidates you're looking at. So it makes sense to manage all that information by having, by using some sort of like standardized test. But then the flip side of it, and we've seen some of these debates in the past year or two in particular is, well, if everyone can kind of be reduced to this like very simple score, like is that really giving us a complete picture of like who the applicant is, and does it become possible to just like end up gaming the system? So then protocols start to become this sort of like constraint of agency where the fullest version of yourself is not really being expressed.
Yeah, it feels like along with simplifying complexity, there's sort of a risk of being too reductionist. If you take a multi-dimensional, n-dimensional human intelligence and bring it down to a single unidimensional score, by definition, you're reducing not only complexity, but also some of the beauty of an individual human into that score. I'm wondering if we could move on into control mechanisms of protocols. So what are the mechanisms of control for protocols, and what are the different types of them, and how do they relate to each other?
I started out by thinking about the origins of protocols and how they're initially enforced by these more like external authorities. So it could be, like a central regulatory body that creates a set of standards or regulations or API docs or whatever that sort of like sets the protocol for everyone else. It could be these like physical constraints, like as I mentioned earlier, like code. Code is a type of physical constraint that creates the terms for a protocol that needs to be followed. Or it could be something that is socially enforced among your peers, where we follow this protocol because it's something that we ought to do. And so there's like all these sort of like external forces that are suggesting that you comply with the protocol. But I think like over time, and this doesn't happen to every protocol, but eventually for some of the strongest protocols, the locus of authority moves from being this like external force that is telling you to comply with something and you're doing it because you feel like you ought to or you have to the protocol just becomes this like a virtuous part of who you are, and you're the one who is now championing it, and you believe that it is like part of your own beliefs. I use like a sort of trivial example, but I think an illustrative one of speed bumps as an example of like they are a physical constraint that tells you to slow down, right? So like you have no choice when you hit a speed bump, you need to slow down. But like eventually it's not really like, why do the speed bumps continue to persist over time, even though like theoretically we could remove them if we didn't want to or whatever. And they persist because people believe that speed bumps are really good for traffic, good for safety, good for your neighborhoods. And so they become this like virtuous thing that we then, advocate should exist, even though there's actually like this whole body of evidence that speed bumps end up reducing the number of overall lives lost, because like they also, in addition to slowing down cars, they're slowing down emergency vehicles. And people in crisis are now getting to the hospital later than they could. So it's not clear that speed bumps actually save lives, but everyone is sort of just like over time and just trained to believe that is a good thing. You might say, I don't know, maybe like a lot of like security theater falls into this as well, or public health kind of theater around. It's a thing that you were initially told to do. We were told to put, masks on, or told to take off your shoes when you go through TSA or whatever. But like eventually becomes this thing where, like, I think younger people today don't even know why we take off our shoes at TSA. They just do it because that's what you're supposed to do. People, like wearing masks has become like a very like virtuous thing that people do. So even though it initially started with someone else telling you what to do, it eventually becomes something that you have internalized and are evangelizing yourself.
Well, there's a lot there, and I think there's really some profound points to be made here. One that comes to mind for me is control mechanisms of protocols that have lags in their enforcement versus those who don't. So basically, a speed bump is immediately physically enforced on cars and emergency vehicles that go over it. By the laws of physics, it's enforced. But a cop that's hiding behind a bush and is going to pull you over, there's a lag time, and they're only fractionally enforced. The speed limit is only fractionally enforced if there's a law, a police officer around. And so just like the difference between protocols that are enforced within the constraints of our everyday life versus those that are enforced by outside authorities is kind of interesting to me. And specifically, since this is a crypto podcast, I'll mention that I feel like there's a difference between filing a lawsuit against someone and then waiting 18 months in order to get heard, and then there's another 6 months in order to enforce the actual law, versus smart contracts, which are just immediately enforceable by calling a RPC on a blockchain node. And so the lag time between the actual action that the agents take in the system and the enforcement and how that changes the perceptions of, oh, this law isn't really enforced in practice versus, oh, this is enforced immediately by the constraints of the environment, creates different behavior within the agents. And I think that's kind of interesting to me. I don't know if you have any riffs on top of that.
Yeah, I think that plays into sort of these questions around like, what does good or bad protocol design look like, which I end up touching on. And that was one of the things that I talked about was when there is this like long lag time between I do something and then like it's not even clear whether it is being enforced. Maybe it's enforced inconsistently. So, again, like taking your stuff through TSA, sometimes you get something prohibited. You get your bottle of water through, or you get your like pocket knife through, and you're just like, well, now I feel like I don't know whether this protocol really works or not. So yeah, inconsistency in how it's enforced, and then also just like long lag times and enforcing is regardless of whether the protocol is serving a useful purpose or not, is like a form of bad design, right? So yeah, I would definitely share that view that like a faster reinforced by response time is like part of a good design.
Okay, so we've got control mechanisms of protocols, and I've got these divided into 3 different categories: physical constraints, centralized authority, and pure enforcement. The next point that I've got in my notes here is moving from explicit to implicit over time. So I'm wondering if we could pinch and zoom on that.
This was one of my guiding questions over the summer of, just trying to like ground all this work in something tangible. Was, if you're going to write a 50-year or 100-year history of protocols and you're trying to describe like how is, protocols as a concept, how has it evolved or changed over time? Like where are protocols going next? And I think like it's kind of a thorny question to answer versus it being this like persistent concept. And so that was where I was thinking about, okay, in the like protocolization 1.0 era or mindset, protocols have obviously existed probably like forever since we've had human civilization or need for coordination. But I think there was this sort of like boom that happened with the industrial era because suddenly you had this explosion of information that needed to be managed somehow. And that's where you started seeing this interest in a bureaucratic mindset and interest in like standardization and this strong emphasis on institutions as an enforcement mechanism. And that was sort of when we think of the, industrial era, or the early, going from probably like late 1800s to like mid 1900s, mid to late 1900s. That was sort of that was the role that protocols served. They were the sort of like bureaucratic mechanisms. But then things started to like change a little bit, and what started to change, I think, was the internet and everything sort of before and after it, where you suddenly have, this, again, explosion of information, but it's not just information in the sense, in the sort of like manufacturing industrial kind of sense, but it's an explosion of ideas. And that was sort of like fostered by the internet. And now there's this question of, we have all these like unorganized ideas floating around the internet. How do we cleanly package those up and standardize them? And that's sort of the like protocolization 2.0 kind of mindset that I think we're just starting to enter into now. And so where in the past, like when we think about protocols are much more like explicitly defined by some sort of authority or some, laws or regulations. They're protocols that like our peers enforce among each other and can like very explicitly state. Now the weird thing about protocols is like they're sort of just like internalized to us, and we can't tell like what is it when I'm expressing a view or I'm sharing an idea, like is it really my idea or is it something that has kind of been neatly packaged up and served up to me that I'm just sort of like internalizing as my own. So I think implicit protocols are much more difficult to identify than explicit ones, but they're now sort of like governing all of our behavior and what we choose to do for work and how we choose to spend our time. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of like where we're going now.
Yeah, I think it's sort of interesting to see how different generations react to protocols. One that might have been explicit to the baby boomers is maybe just implicit to someone in Gen Z. And, there's sort of like in that manifests in a generational divide in values and the why behind people following different protocols. So just seeing the evolution of protocols from explicit to implicit is sort of an interesting trend for me to see now. I'm wondering if we can move on into protocols as systems of social control. So basically enabling levels of agency versus hindering human agency. How do you see that spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, actually, probably maybe more curious about like how you think about it.
Yeah.
I think I have just consistently felt this tension, in particular, I'd say specifically how people talk about the limitations of social platforms today, and how if only we had protocols to replace these centralized platforms, everything would be better. And then also seeing it a lot in sort of like crypto governance experiments, and in all of these situations, I hear this promise constantly that like we will be more in control of our lives if we only had more protocols. But then I sort of look at all these historical examples outside of technology, and it doesn't feel like protocols necessarily, liberate us or make us more individual. They work because they standardize and reduce complexity. And so I think, there's just some sort of tension there where sometimes that's really good. Sometimes we need protocols to reduce complexity. If we had to, come at every single situation in our lives cold and have to make an individual decision about it, that would be exhausting. So I don't think protocols are bad. That's why I called this topic like dangerous protocols, because they're not good, they're not bad. It's just that there's this sort of nuance around it, right? But I don't think that I don't think that protocols offer us more complexity or more customizability or just like the ability to, they don't really give us more agency in our lives. So that's sort of the inconsistency that I've sort of identified in conversations today.
Yeah, well, maybe if I can take your invitation to say what I think, maybe we could dive in on the social media portion of maybe the social media debate about social media platforms versus protocols. The point of hindering of human agency that I see a critique of, say, Twitter or Facebook is with respect to deplatforming. So basically, you do something that might be against the terms of service of a platform, and then without any due process, you're deplatformed. So your entire social life on that platform, the social network that you created, the identity that you created, is now removed, and you have no due process in order to challenge that, like you would in a in a court system in public life. If there is sanctioned actions taken against you, then you have due process, and you're innocent until proven guilty. And so the move to protocols, Web3 protocols, I think is meant to be a way of codifying the locus of control within social media to not be some department that's not accountable to you, but to be a credibly neutral protocol that can't deplatform you. And maybe it depends on the protocol design, but the deplatforming of someone in a protocol that has implemented due process may have several points of appeals and checks of balances of power. And so, to me, that's sort of an interesting difference between a company that may be a bunch of socially enforced protocols versus a blockchain-based protocol for social media. And so, I'd be curious if that sort of meets your criteria of protocols as a system of social control, and how they live in different places in decentralized crypto-based protocols versus more Web2 tech giant-based companies?
Yeah, I mean, that's like a very, very thorny topic, obviously.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of thoughts on it, but yeah, and it's hard to separate out, the question of like platforms versus protocols, and then like centralization versus decentralization or whatever. But I think
Yeah.
When people talk about what makes protocols better than platforms, there is some aspect of this like ability to sort of set the rules that you want to have, and this. Yeah, I think it is often intertwined with this notion of like a decentralized authority. Like there's no one single person in control. It's kind of just a system or a way of doing things. I find, at least for myself, when I kind of drill into some of the like trickier, content moderation questions or governance questions, neither solution is perfect, but a sort of like decentralized governance setup raises just as many questions for me as centralized ones as well. And this issue at some point, I remember with Internet Archive, where I wanted to implement sort of like a no follow rule for, I just like categorically didn't, want to be archived. And trying to, it turned into this whole thing where, there should be a convention set for it. And there was, once upon a time, there was a convention, but the convention had now expired. This is, many years ago now. I'm rehashing old grievances, but I remember, trying to figure out how do I get this thing to stop doing a thing that I don't want it to do? And, trying to email the people there, but because there's, there just isn't that much support. No one was really responding to me. They were responding very consistently. There was just nothing that I could do about it. And I remember thinking at the time, I was like, man, if this was like Google or something, it would honestly be a lot easier to they would definitely have a way to just, press a button and fix this problem for me. Yeah. And so I think when we talk about the governance clashes of being a user on a centralized social platform that's being managed by a big tech giant, you feel the clash when there's something that you as the user want and that the company can't provide you or is denying you. And those clashes are obviously very visible and it's really felt. But there's also, on the flip side, I think you can run into those same issues with decentralized authorities or with protocols that are sort of where there's no one to really appeal to if this thing is controlling you. There's no way to really escape it. And I find that at least as concerning as and maybe even more so because who do you really fight? Who is the villain there? And I think that social platforms tend to be more visible villains or punching bags because you can at least say, oh, this thing is driving me crazy. But I think protocols are actually kind of weirdly more controlling and harder to pin down when you do have these inevitable clashes.
One vector to look at this is company versus protocol, but another vector is basically governance structures. So you can have a company or a protocol that's designed to be governed by the people that it serves. And so you kind of have a closed loop between consumer to company protocol that it serves, and then who are the managers or who is the protocol governed by. If it's the same participants then as the people that it serves, then you have this consent of the governed loop that exists. Whereas with traditional corporations or for-profit companies, you have their shareholders on one side of you as a manager, and you have your users on the other side, and you have a fiduciary duty to extract from your users to give to your shareholders. Or I guess the crypto equivalent of this would be that if the users of the protocol are different from the people who hold the tokens, then you're going to have a bifurcation of people who the protocol serves. And so for me, it's all about preserving that loop of the consent of the governed. The users should be actually governing the company or the protocol that they serve, and that will lead us away from bad protocols or bad companies. I don't know if that resonates with you at all, but that's just another vector to splice it along instead of just company and protocol.
Yeah, and I think it does resonate. I think it's just, again, it's not that protocols are good or bad. They're just fundamentally different, and I don't think they're this universal panacea for all the problems that we face today. And I was mostly interested in exploring with this project, okay, let's take for granted that we are, being governed by protocols. What are how do we know whether we're in a good or a bad protocol? How do we, if we are in a situation that we're not enjoying, like how do we actually subvert that or work through it or around it? Like one of the points that I ended up making was that I think it's very hard to just sort of exit a protocol when you're, because it's so closely tied to a network that you're a part of. So how do you subvert a protocol or work through a protocol? And I think like we see that happening a lot right now, and even in social media use today, where people don't just like quit Twitter necessarily, but maybe they'll use it in a different way. They'll get an alt or something so they can continue to say what they want, but not have it be tied to their identity. So I think there's, there are a lot of ways to sort of work through the governance instead of just sort of explicitly resisting it or throwing it away. But that's a different set of rules entirely.
Well, there's a bunch more I want to get through for your paper, but we only have 7 minutes left, so maybe we'll speed through some of these last points. I wonder if you could tell me about the fog of war problem in bad protocol, basically where participants are trapped in suboptimal systems, but they have a fog of war. Yeah,
I think we touched this a little bit earlier as well in talking about that lag time between, a protocol being enforced and you taking action. So I was trying to sort of identify a bunch of different criteria, which I called the Kafka index, because, you're being trapped in this sort of disorienting maze when you're in a bad protocol. Just, different types of criteria around like, how do you know when you're in a bad protocol? And so one of them was, lack of a feedback loop, no way to sort of like measure how things are going. And I think all this sort of contributes to this, sense of like a fog of war, where the protocol might technically be functioning. And so we'll see this in, like the healthcare system or academic science publishing, how, it does technically all work and everyone continues to participate in it. And so it's sort of like stable in a way. But it's also just unsatisfying somehow to be part of these protocols. And so that's like, I think there's that's sort of like fog where you can't quite see how to get out of it, but you're also like you're also in it.
Yeah. I actually flew out to the Summer of Protocols for one day. And you and I were in a group together in which we had to design what we called a Kafka-esque protocol, and ended up designing, I think it was like an insurance company claims tree where you could never actually really get through to a human to actually submit your claim. It is like a life or death thing. You have to get reimbursed for some healthcare expense you have, but you keep on getting routed to new different agents and different mechanisms that are never really inputting your concerns. And that was a fun exercise for me because I think we all have experience with phone trees and with insurance companies as Kafka's protocols. But anything more to say about that?
As we're sort of drawing out, getting stuck in these like whirlpools where you're like, kind of going around in a circle and everyone's had this experience on a phone tree where you just, no matter what button you press, you kind of end up back at the same start. And it's, that's sort of like you're in it, you're progressing, but like, where are you actually going?
Fun as an intellectual exercise, but frustrating as hell to be in.
Not in practice.
Can you tell me about the three archetypes of protocol goodness?
Again, it's just sort of trying to say, okay, we spend a lot of time talking about the bad things about protocols, but like, what does a good protocol actually look like? What purpose are they really trying to serve? And was trying to identify the balance between, I think like ideally, in a perfect world, a protocol balances this power between taking away the decisions that you don't want to be making, reducing unnecessary decision making, reducing complexity, so that you can go off and like be more agentic in the world and focus on the things that you actually want to focus on. Like that is what a good protocol should do. So it has this like balance of power between the two. And so, they call that sort of like the Whitehead archetype, after this quote from Whitehead about how, you're going to have to read it off for me. But about, the human civilization advances by, the number of things that we can kind of automate away to all these different, different processes. And then the flip side of that being, the Kafka version where the protocol is far too powerful and you're being trapped in this kind of maze as the individual, feeling that you're being actually like very like constrained by the protocol. And then the other flip side of that being the sort of Barbie archetype that I mentioned there, that which is, name came from this short story of this guy who's like, working and decides to sort of like inexplicably stop really doing any work, and his colleagues ask him to do stuff, and he's just sort of like, I'd prefer not to. And so this is like the archetypal person that is highly agentic, but like too agentic, right? Eventually this guy in the story starves to death and dies because he just doesn't want to do anything. And so if you have this sort of like, balanced version of balance of power between the protocol and the participant, you can either kind of skew on the side of the protocol having too much power and you're trapped in this maze, or the participant having too much power is also bad, where, we do need protocols to make our lives move faster. You can't just like opt out of everything. But if you opt out of too many things, then you end up kind of shooting yourself in the foot and not being able to do as many things in the world as you want to.
That's so neat. Okay, so there's Kafkaesque protocols, which is when you're kind of trapped in a maze and you can't get out of it. There's Bartleby protocols where the individual agents are too agentic and they're not actually able to adhere to the protocol. So it's kind of like the opposite of the Kafkaesque protocols. And then there's the Whitehead protocols, which is basically the idea that human civilization advances when we can process more operations together. And so basically, the more protocols that we have that are serving the needs of the participants, human civilization advances. And I guess like TCP/IP would be an example of this. We can now process more information than we can before. Or maybe Ethereum, if we're being generous to the crypto ecosystem, is a Whitehead advance because we can now process more financial operations than we could before. I think that we're getting towards the bottom of the hour, and I'm just so thankful to you for doing this interview with me. I think that your essay, Dangerous Protocols, really opened my mind in many ways to the different ways that protocols can be good or dangerous, and I just really enjoyed reading it. So as I understand it, the essays from Summer of Protocols are not yet available, but as I understand it, they will eventually be made available, and the listener can find them at summerofprotocols.com when they are made available. Yeah, in the meantime, how can people find you online and read what you've been up to?
Either on Twitter, my username is Naifia, Nayiafia, or just my website, nadia.xyz.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the GreenPilled podcast, and keep up the great work, Nadia. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers. What a fun episode. We just heard from Nadia Asparouhova about dangerous protocols. Thanks again for listening to the GreenPilled.network podcast. We are building a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers focused on using crypto to bring positive sum digital systems to the world. I think Nadia and the whole Summer of Protocols cohort is a great example of this, establishing a field of protocol research and propagating forward a body of knowledge about positive sum protocols in the world. If you value our work, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review. Peace and love. I will see you next time.